Welcome back to the Universalis podcast. I am Martin Kochański, the creator of Universalis, and in this episode I'll be looking at the highlights of the week ahead, starting with Sunday the 3rd of November. We are told it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, but then we are also told that nothing is impossible for God. This week we have two rich saints who have made it to heaven despite their handicaps. On Wednesday the 6th, the Carmelites celebrate Saint Nuno Alvarez Pereira. The Carmelite calendar is full of surprises, and here is one of them. A rich Carmelite saint sounds enough of a contradiction to be worth investigating. Nuno was born in 1360 into a Portuguese noble family. Portugal seems remote and obscure for most of us, and so does the 14th century. One of the glories of the saints is the corners of history that they illuminate for us. At the age of 25, Nuno was named Constable of Portugal, effectively the commander-in-chief of the army. At the time, Portugal was fighting for its survival. The King of Castile considered the existence of a separate kingdom to the west of him to be both untidy and unnecessary, and was taking steps to eliminate it. The war to preserve Portugal's independence lasted on and off for almost 30 years. Under Nuno's leadership, Portugal won, even though her armies were sometimes 5 times smaller than the Spanish ones and less well equipped. But victory in battle is not what makes a saint. There was more to Nuno than that. For a good Christian warrior, going to battle is an adventure with 2 possible outcomes, both of them good. Either he wins, which is good, or he dies trying, in which case he is with God, even better. A good Christian warrior has nothing to fear. To be a good Christian warrior, it is first necessary to be a good Christian. Nuno had the name of Mary inscribed on his sword. His personal banner showed nothing but a cross. He required his armies to be like him. He urged his soldiers to pray and to receive the sacraments. He was strict on moral behavior in camp. And to defeated enemies and stranded civilians alike, he insisted on respect and mercy. When, during one of his campaigns, the Castilian population was found to be starving, he personally paid for them all to be fed. In the end, the fighting was over and the kingdom of Portugal was secure. Nuno's daughter was married to a son of the king, and their descendants would found the House of Braganza, which would rule Portugal and Brazil for centuries. Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II of England. Now was the time for Nuno to retire to a life of ease, comfort, and universal adulation. He did not. He began by spending whatever was needed to support the veterans of the war. Once they had been provided for, he built churches and monasteries up and down the country. Finally, at the age of 63, he himself entered the Carmelite convent he had founded in Lisbon, not as an honoured founder, but as a simple lay brother, Brother Nuno of St. Mary. In that role he spent the rest of his life in the service of Jesus in the poor. He died on Easter Sunday 1431, and the people immediately acclaimed him as a saint. For various complicated reasons, he was not actually officially canonized until 2009. I wonder how many other forgotten saints there are lying around in the corners of history waiting for someone to remember them. They are reigning with Christ in glory, but there will surely come a time when the Holy Spirit reminds us who they are. A time when we are most in need of their virtues and their example. Meanwhile, I suppose that Nuno does give a lesson to the rich, that freedom is after all possible. You can show your accumulated wealth who is master. You can use it to do the good that only you can do, and finally you can escape whatever remains of it. Now let's move back 2 days, to Monday the 4th, and forward a bit over a century, to Italy in the time of the Catholic Reformation and the Council of Trent. Charles Borromeo was born on the 2nd of October 1538 in the castle of Arona on the shores of Lake Maggiore, to a long-established and powerful family. It was not just a matter of castles and land. The family either owned or administered huge territories. In a grand family like that, the eldest son is the heir. He is the one who is going to preserve the family's wealth and power for the next generation. The second son projects that power in a different direction, into the church. Thus it has been with many families in many places across the centuries. Charles was the second son. When he had finished university, his uncle, the Pope, summoned him to Rome and made him a cardinal. He was put in charge of the Diocese of Milan, there being no archbishop at the time. He was also made protector of the Catholic cantons of Switzerland and also protector of the Franciscans and the Carmelites. He was 21 and still a layman. The history of the Council of Trent is of successive popes knowing that reform was needed and trying to summon a council to accomplish it, while the great powers of Europe, whether prince, king, or emperor, did their best to stop anything from happening or tried to take control of it if it did. A weak and divided church is an enormous benefit to a secular prince. It cannot authoritatively tell him how to behave, and all its assets are available for him to steal or give to his friends or use in any way he wants. At the time when Charles came onto the scene, the Council of Trent had been suspended for something like 7 years by the forces of international politics. With his family connections and his diplomatic skills, Charles played an important part in the reopening of the council in 1562. Charles's elder brother now died. This logically meant that Charles ought to be the Borromeo of the next generation and become the heir to the ownership and management of the Borromean lands. His family advised it. Even the Pope, his uncle, said the same. They saw divine providence intervening to give him the job he must undertake. But Charles saw divine providence showing him, in his brother's death, the vanity of all human wishes. He responded definitively and irreversibly by secretly being ordained a priest. The Pope gave in with good grace and made him Archbishop of Milan. It is one thing to know that reform is needed and try to do something about it. It is another thing to decree the necessary measures, a huge thing in the case of the Council of Trent with all the princes of Europe against it. But the biggest thing is to put those decrees into effect. Without courageous people to do that, all those reforms are paper, nothing more. Arriving in Milan, Charles began the process of reform at the very top by giving away much of his own property to the poor. It is difficult to argue against an example such as that. When famine struck the province, he fed 3,000 poor people at his own expense daily for 3 months, and inspired others to do likewise. When in turn plague struck, he made his will, prepared himself for death, and went to the hospital where the worst cases were. Someone could have told him, "You are far too important to take risks like this. Your leadership is needed. Send someone junior." If they did, he didn't listen. After enormous amounts of nagging, preaching, and persuasion, the clergy at length did begin to follow his example. Charles could not have accomplished what he did in the way of reform if many people at every level had not been wanting it to happen. But equally, plenty of them were happy with the way things were. When Charles moved to restore the Dominican convents to their intended austerity, his aunts, who were nuns there and entirely comfortable with things the way they were, took it as a personal insult. The canons of one church slammed the doors in his face when he came on a visitation and fired at him. One order of bloated monks went further and sent one of their number in disguise to join Charles's household at evening prayer and shoot him. The bullet went through his clothing but barely injured him. And when Charles made a visitation of the Catholic cantons of Switzerland, he found that some of the senior priests were practicing witchcraft and sorcery. These are just some of the highlights of a complicated 15-year campaign which included excommunications, denunciations, arrests, but also absolutions. In the end, the reform was successful, but it had taken the energies of a lifetime to accomplish. Whenever reform is needed, decreeing it is easy compared to actually going out there and bringing it about. There have to be people on the ground who, like Charles, are willing to struggle for years if necessary and without any certainty of success. Some people, by good example and the grace of God, are able to accept reform and benefit from it. Institutions can be different. They have a will of their own. That order of monks whose members had tried to assassinate Charles had to be dissolved in the end by the Pope and its assets put towards other good causes. That was an embarrassing end for an order which had achieved many good things in its 400 years of existence, but where institutions are concerned, it sometimes happens that where one cannot cure, one must kill. But let's be encouraged about something here all the same. The thing about the Church is that she is always dying and always being renewed. There are always old, rotten trees in the forest, and when a tree gets like that, it needs to be felled. We all hear the crash. What we don't hear is what also goes on all the time, half out of sight. Young saplings are always springing up in the glades and clearings of the forest. Given time, some of them will grow up to be glorious giants in their own right. After its kick-off with All Saints and All Souls, November as a whole is designated as the month of the dead. Accordingly, this is a time when we should remember to celebrate the gift of death. Yes, I say celebrate and I say gift. The first step is to see how it is a gift and is worth celebrating. The pagan world sees death as a disaster, a catastrophe. This is the bad result of some good progress. 150 years ago, few of us would have reached adulthood without having lost a close relative, often a brother or sister. It's quite possible that we would have seen it. Nobody should die alone and unsupported. 100 years ago, even leaving wars to one side, most of us would have known someone who had died. But now one can easily reach middle age without losing anyone significant, in some cases practically without knowing anyone who has. Most people have never seen anyone die. None of this is in itself bad. Nobody would want to go back. But the good in terms of individual human survival is balanced out by a weird attitude that has grown up to death itself. To put it very briefly, what you don't see doesn't exist. If you don't see death, deep down in your unconscious mind you are convinced that death never happens. And when something that never happens, it is terrifying. It is no good saying we are Christians, we know better than the pagans. In theory it's true. We proclaim a right attitude in church every week when we profess our faith in the resurrection. But that is only 1 hour of the 168 in the week. And for the other 167 hours we are just like everybody else. We simply don't put the theory into practice. You only have to look at the pandemic to see. All over the world, governments reasoned like this. Death never happens, so if it happens now, it is going to be somebody's fault. Ours. They imprisoned whole populations. Thousands died of suicide brought on by isolation. Whole generations will spend the rest of their lives marked by the time when they were kept in solitary confinement. And where were we Christians in all this? Were we bearing witness? We were not. We were keeping our heads down and lazily conforming. We believed, but our belief bore no fruit. The first step towards a sound relationship with death is to look at it. Death is not exceptional, we all do it at some time. Death in itself is not bad or sad. What death is big. We are used to being the biggest thing in our own lives. One trouble we have with death is that it is bigger than us. What death is definitive. Almost everything nowadays is provisional, or at least that's how it's presented. If you don't like it, if it isn't working for you, you can try something else. You can become someone else. There is no such provisionality about death. Those are some of the sources of discomfort we have, even when as Christians we go round saying that death is the gateway to life. Sometimes the discomfort is minor and mildly comic. Dom Aylward Watkin, the author of Resurrection is Now, used to say, "I do not fear death, but it is such a break from established habits." So how can we begin to regularize death, to find a place for it so that we don't fear it anymore? How can you find a place for something that is too big to fit? What I want to offer you now is a picture. It is a picture which either helps or it doesn't. If it doesn't, ignore it. If it does, build on it. Inhabit it. Death is a gift from God. What does that gift bring? Not termination, not interruption. What death brings is completion. Completion of this earthly life in which we have been becoming ourselves, becoming who we are going to be in eternity. Completion is nothing to be sad or sorry about. In a concert hall, when a symphony ends, the audience applaud. They do not weep. Having a beginning and an end gives our earthly life a shape. It makes, if you like, marks on a map in relation to which every event and every action of our lives finds its place, its context, its meaning. I have talked to more than one person who found a terminal diagnosis a liberation. One became more serene than he had ever been in his life. Another said, mysteriously, that the day he was diagnosed was the happiest day of his life. I couldn't ask for an explanation, but my strong feeling is that a meaningless succession of day after day after day was transformed into something with a shape, something with some hope of a meaning. Death brings not termination or interruption, but completion. Ending is not failure. Think of a piece of music. Until it has finished, until the last note has sounded, it is not complete, it does not properly exist. But then, every note in it has its meaning, from the first to the last. Thus the gift of death is that it gives our life here on earth a shape. So let's think a little about shape. Let me recommend it as an exercise. This is not like an examination of conscience when you are looking at yourself in time and making plans in time. This is outside time. It is timeless. It is not looking at yourself in temporal slices, but at yourself as a whole. This is yourself in God's eyes, yourself as a complete piece of music. You can do this exercise at any time in your life. You don't have to be dying to do it. In the Divine Comedy, when Dante reaches the earthly paradise at the top of Mount Purgatory, he drinks successively from two streams. The first stream comes from Greek myth. It is Lethe, the river whose water destroys all memory of sin and evil. The second is Dante's own invention. He calls it Eunoe, the river of good remembrance, and it restores the memory of the sin, but only as a fact and as the occasion of grace and blessedness. This may be a little like what I am trying to get at with this idea of contemplating shape. All the past, good or evil, things done, things experienced, things suffered, when they are seen as part of the shape of the whole, you will find that they are seen in relation to God's grace. And that is one way of making use of the gift of death. That's all for this week. If you'd like to write to us about anything, send an email to universalis@universalis.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a good week in every sense, and let's pray for one another.